You are listening to Talking Images, the official podcast of icmforum.com. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Chris, and in this episode, I reckon we're talking about Clint Eastwood directing westerns. Or more specifically, every film marked as a western on IMDb, or just films where Clint Eastwood directs himself wearing a cowboy hat. Namely, High Plains Drifter, The Outlaw Josey, Bronco Billy, Honkytonk Man, Pale Rider, Unforgiven, and Cry Macho. So, 7 films, 4 proper westerns, 3 set in the West. And no, it's not a case of us just not knowing what a western is. We were dividing up Eastwood films into chunks that make sense, because if this one does well, we might do some more. So that's a little bit of a side promise for you listeners out there. Plus, there is some connection here beside that hat and the setting, because it's quite a journey from the misanthropic, spiteful High Plains Drifter with hate and anger seeping through just about every shot, where death is to be dealt out without reservation, to the murky, morally grey melancholy of Unforgiven, where killing a man is hard and painful. A film that cuts the cord on the glamorous illusion of the West, to the modern-day-ish western landscapes of Cry Macho, where a 91-year-old Eastwood laments the folly and bravado of youth and their need to be just what he was once so synonymous with: macho. From arguable misfires to masterpieces, this is quite a batch. And a final shout out, if you want more on Clint Eastwood, the Western icon, we've already covered the Dollar Trilogy, so feel free to jump back to hear just how badass we think those films are once you're done listening to this episode. But I don't think we need to spend more time on this intro here. Without further ado, let's get this conversation started. And fittingly, given the theme, this is possibly our most American episode to date, with Adam from New York being back after a long hiatus. We also have Ben from Arkansas, and to avoid a little bit of confusion, Scottish Adam is here as well. So we'll be talking about it, but we should divide them up and call our New York Adam American Adam. American Adam, get some debates in there. We'll see what accents we try to pull off as well. But at least the Americans are represented, and one even from the West. I think New York is officially East, though there are some Easterns as well out there. Anyways, despite his geographical location, I know that you, American Adam, are a lover of all things Westerns. We've had you on for our previous Western episodes as well. You're probably one of the most insightful people we've had on the Western topics. So I'd love to hear from you first. What do you think about Clint Eastwood, not just as a Western star, but first and foremost as a director of Westerns?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Hello, everyone. Glad to be back here on the podcast. What Chris said is accurate. I'm a huge Eastwood fan and a huge fan of Westerns since I was really a young child, and Eastwood's Westerns in particular were always a favorite of mine. Having rewatched some of these movies, I didn't get to others. What really strikes me is the extent to which, let's call his main Westerns, and I'm talking about High Plains Drifter, Josey, Pale Rider, and Unforgiven, the extent to which they are sort of a cohesive body of work. Obviously, as Chris mentioned, there are a lot of commonalities across those 4 movies. Some of them, seem to be spiritual successors of others. But if you look at them all together, they sort of provide this cohesive theme or exploration of what the Western means. So I'm very impressed with Eastwood's work with Westerns, and I can't help thinking this is really, his work is the culmination of a career spent on Westerns, that, he spent his early years as a regular on the TV series Rawhide. And then he appeared in several Westerns just as an actor, Dollar's Trilogy most famously, but some other good Westerns as well. And it's clear that he didn't get sort of stuck in a pattern with Westerns. Some people, they start doing Westerns and they're happy to keep doing it the same way they've always done it. And yeah, Eastwood repeats himself sometimes, but it seems that all those years spent working on Westerns really gave him the opportunity to think through what the West means and what he wanted to say about the West as a film artist.
That's a very nice summary there, American Adam. And we'll definitely start looking at those parallels, those connections, and just what the body of work says very, very soon. But before that, we'd like to hear from our other American on the panel. Ben, same question for you. Like, how do you feel about Clint Eastwood's body of work in the Western genre?
Well, something must be clarified first. Arkansas isn't in the West, it's in the South. Technically, it's on the very edge of the West. Like, Fort Smith, Arkansas was considered one of the gateways to the West.
Yes, exactly. Like, Arkansas is a common setting for a lot of Westerns, but I'm shooting myself in the foot here, I guess. You know your geography much better than me.
If you go to the U.S. and say you're in the West and you're in Arkansas, you will get corrected.
All right, I'll take that though. I'll take that as I'm correct. If a little portion, little sliver of your state is considered Western, I'll sleep peacefully tonight. Anyways, back to the main question.
Eastwood as a director is interesting to me. He has a very no nonsense approach to directing that I think works really well in the Western setting. And if I were to summarize how I view these films, I agree with Adam that there is a kind of cohesiveness to them in both his characterization. And I mean, that could be, you could argue that that's kind of tied to his limited range as an actor, but I don't think that's only it. Although I think he is a little more limited in acting range than some others. But also just in the way that the films flow. And it's interesting to track Eastwood's career over time. You can see it mellow as he grows older, and the themes that he's personally wrestling with start to bubble up into his films a lot more. I think Unforgiven really is kind of a turning point in his directing career for a variety of reasons. If you look at everything he had done before that, there are a lot of misanthropic, very violent, kind of dark films. And Unforgiven is this turning point where he starts to lean more into his, what you would say, his more sensitive side. Not to say he hadn't done those kind of films before. He'd done things like Breezy. But, he has one of his biggest successes with Bridges over Madison County after that. And, that kind of also kind of paves the way for him to start working behind the camera more too. It's almost like with Unforgiven, he said everything he needed to say on that topic and decided to move forward in a different direction.
Yeah, that's a very good way of putting it, Ben. I think it should be added too that Eastwood actually had the script for Unforgiven since the mid-70s, and he was actively saving it for himself for when he felt old enough, and he actually wanted in advance for that to be his final Western, his final goodbye. So it's interesting to think that he had this in his back of his mind. I'm not sure if it was he already had it when he did Josey Wales, but he definitely had it when he did Pale Rider. And he knew that film would be his goodbye. And while Cry Macho is kind of Western, it's set in the 70s, 80s, so it is definitely not, even though he's wearing the cowboy hat, he's a cowboy, literal cowboy. That was his final testament on the Old West. And I think when American Adam there said earlier that it is like a somewhat cohesive body of work that tells a story in a way, definitely an interesting progression between these films. So well put indeed. And moving on to my fellow European here on today's panel, Scottish Adam. Of course, there are a lot of Scottish emigres in the Western genre. There's a lot of Brits coming over as well, so it's not that unfamiliar in all of it. What's your relationship with Clint Eastwood as a director, and especially as a director of Western films?
Well, I think it's going to be a hard episode for me because the hosts that we have on today are just, I think, incredibly knowledgeable and articulate about films and about Westerns. But I'll say a few points throughout the episode, but not as much as normal, maybe. I've seen most of Clint Eastwood's films as an actor and a director, and my interest kind of started my uncle, who was my hero kind of growing up, his favorite actor was Clint Eastwood, and then that passed down to my cousin, it passed down to me. So that's kind of what started my interest in Eastwood films. Although, unlike probably a lot of people, I got into Eastwood through other films. My introduction to Eastwood wasn't really through westerns. So some of my favorites of Eastwood are not westerns, or some of the films that I remember from when I was a kid tend to be from other genres. The four main westerns that we've talked about today in the introduction, I agree with the other points that were made, that they feel a bit like a body of work. It feels almost like you can see Clint Eastwood as a director evolve and even the genre itself evolve. So by the time you get to Unforgiven, I think it's really the peak, and it's also a reflection of the changing tone of his career and his films. Like was said before, after Unforgiven, suddenly you've got films like Bridges of Madison County, and I think there's a really different direction that the films go in. And then I think the other three films that we'll speak about a little bit, Honkytonk Man, Bronco Billy, and Cry Macho, they're almost like, they're not really what we would consider westerns, but they're almost a sort of fantasy western. So, like Bronco Billy is all about people pretending to be like something else. Um, Honkytonk Man is him as a singer. I feel like those three films are a little bit more like the main four films are kind of deconstructing westerns, trying to put a different angle on westerns, and then the other three films that we talk about are kind of like the characters in a sort of fantasy land of like Bronco Billy or being a singer in Honky Man. And yeah, that's all I can really say. Sorry.
No, I mean, I think you're onto something interesting here in that the four films that are actual, proper westerns set in the Old West. They are obviously all revisionist. I mean, we're in the revisionist era here. It's all about taking away the glamour of the Old West is mostly gone. All of these the old genre conventions of the 50s and early 60s aren't really there. I mean, High Plains Drifter, all violence. Outlaw Josey looks at Indians in a very different way. Pale Rider might. I mean, we're gonna get to that a little bit. So connections with Shane, who we discussed in another episode later. It might be the closest we'll get to quote unquote the traditional Western, but it's still not quite. And then you have Unforgiven as this final magnus opus, and in my opinion, it could be the best Western ever made. It's a masterpiece. There's obviously the Sergio Leone films that stands here next to it, but it's hands down one of the, I would probably say top 3 westerns ever made. So that's probably going to be the big chunk of the discussion, unless we just all talk about how great it is and don't manage to bring up anything of substance. But I think you're also very, very right in that those 3 other films that are set in the West and are categorized as westerns on IMDb, even though they're not in the right era, they're all about dreams in a way. They're all road movies. They're all about chasing something, some kind of vision. Like in Bronco Billy, like you said, everyone's trying to be what they say they want to be, or they're trying to become their dreams. In Honkytonk Man, you have this kid looking at his uncle and fantasizing about this mystical, fantastical life he might have, even though he's an absolute drunkard. And Eastwood, as the drunken uncle, has big dreams of his own. And then even in Cry Macho, you have the boy riding with him, which was once again a nice connection with Honkytonk Man, really fantasizing about this sense of machismo, this sense of what Eastwood used to represent and what his character in that film used to represent as well. So while they're not proper westerns, there are some nice connections we'll definitely get to later. And I think that might be my answer to the question as well, in a roundabout way. And my answer to all of this, I'm not going to repeat myself too much. I think we can just get into the first film, and we'll just go in chronological order, and we'll see what kind of connections we make as we progress. And just start there then with High Plains Drifter from 1973, Eastwood's second feature, unless you count. I think he did a little bit of direction for Dirty Harry as well, if I recall correctly, but that was obviously not a solo project. This was after Play Misty for me. Interesting start for someone so connected with westerns. But here, he is back as a man with no name, essentially, at least until the ending. It's about a stranger who rides into a town with a dark, dark secret that's fearing retaliation. And as I said in the opener, this might just be the most hateful, loathsome, misanthropic Western film I've seen. There's some others out there. Sergei Kubuchi managed to put out some really, really nasty films too. I mean, we can talk about The Great Silence, absolutely fantastic. We can talk about something like Hellriders, etc. But this film, like the lack of any sort of reverence it has for human life, for bodily anatomy, for any kind of relative decency, is just ugly, ugly, ugly. So much hate. It's it's Frank Peckinpah on steroids. And I think this used to be your favorite film, right, Adam? From New York, mind you, American Adam?
Yes, that's true. I think somewhere between the age of maybe 10 and 15, if you'd asked me what was my favorite movie in the world, I would have said High Plains Drifter. Maybe an unusual choice for a relatively young kid. But when I was that age, I was so overwhelmed by this movie, by first of all, its cynicism and pessimism, as you've identified. But I also thought stylistically it was a fascinating movie. And, you know, I loved Eastwood. I loved the Eastwood character, the tough guy, the one-liners. I mean, you know, Ben said he's an actor with limited range, and I agree with. But well within that range is his ability to squint at the camera and deliver the most sardonic, tough one-liner you can imagine. So I loved that as a kid too. Chris, I agree with you. This movie is stunningly misanthropic, and I once described it in a paper I wrote in college as the logical endpoint of the revisionist trend in Westerns. Whereas the traditional Western celebrates the town, the coming of civilization to the wilderness, this subverts that by looking at the town as the locus of evil. This is a town that is built on a lie. It's a town filled with almost entirely negative characters, so much so that even our protagonist, can't even call him an anti-hero, you know, who's a killer and a rapist. He might be the most redeemable character in a town full of awful characters. So that sort of stunned me as a kid, and I still admire it to this day. And it does feel like after this that the Western can't get more negative. And it doesn't seem coincidental that the Western kind of died off in the second half of the 70s. I'm not saying this movie specifically led to that, but the entire revisionist trend in Western at some point couldn't go any further. It was too negative, and there was really no further territory to explore.
Oh, well, that's a heavy burden to carry on the shoulders of High Plains Drifters, but I think you might be very much onto something there. I mean, essentially, we went from little kids worshipping cowboys as heroes to seeing them as something very different. Though, indeed, as you said, your 10-year-old self did still love this movie. Moving on to you, Ben, what was your reaction to seeing High Plains Drifter, but for the first time and then now as a repeat and just in general? Like, how would you characterize it?
You know, I honestly can't remember my reaction to it when I first watched it, because that was, I don't know, 20 plus years ago. I think I was in college and kind of, you know, catching up on movies that I felt like I should have watched a long time ago. I do remember liking it quite a bit. I would almost describe it as like High Noon Goes to Hell, kind of literally. To Adam's point, it is incredibly mean-spirited. You know, I think also to his point, Eastwood, you know, I said he has a limited range, but he knows what his strengths are and he plays to them really well. And this movie, it really is just a vile, hateful piece of film. And it is all the better because of that. I'm not sure I would agree that it's like the linchpin of the final nail in the coffin of the Western, but because there were a lot of other mean-spirited Westerns coming out around that same time. You know, you mentioned Corbucci. He put out several. Even his comedies like Sonny and Jed were incredibly mean-spirited. You know, the main character was an unabashed rapist. It's a kind of trend that I'm glad that High Plains Drifter exists, but I'm also glad that it didn't pave the way for all Westerns going forward. Because I don't like wallowing in misery too much.
And what about you, Scottish Adam? Do you like wallowing in the misery of High Plains Drifter?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would echo Ben a bit there as well in terms of I think it's a very good film, but it's not the kind of film that I would want to watch on a regular basis just because it's a lot darker than I remember. I've seen the film. I've only seen the film once before. I watched it many years ago and I liked it a lot. And then I watched it a few days ago for the second time, and yeah, I didn't remember how dark it was. I didn't remember. I mean, I think American Adam kind of touched on it, but or someone did. There's a kind of feeling where, like, despite Clint Eastwood's character being such a sort of bad guy, he's still almost the hero. Somehow he's almost still the hero of the plot. So it kind of it's quite an interesting watch from the sense that maybe that's part of the whole revisionist Western kind of thing, where he's almost the hero of the plot, but he's also like incredibly flawed and not like more so than I think most of Clint Eastwood's characters in other films. So yeah, I think it's it was a really interesting film in terms of how dark it is and in terms of how you perceive the main character. And yeah, not the kind of film I'd like to watch on a daily basis just because of the darkness of it. And I think some of it is of its time as well. Like the scenes, some of the scenes involving like, you know, the rape scenes, that kind of thing, or some of them are a little bit dated in the sense that I don't think you get that in a film nowadays, which is a good thing as well.
Yeah, I agree with you, Adam. I think the rape scene in particular, it took me off guard. I mean, obviously I remembered it, and there's been so much written about it, and I was waiting for it to happen. But like the way it takes place, the lack of any kind of ambiguity in it is really just a brutal rape in broad daylight with constant fighting and saying no. And then there's this really awkward sense that at one point they kind of like just show her possibly enjoying it, and that's them saying that kind of makes it okay, or it's a straw dog issue. You know, like what are they saying with this? And obviously that the woman who is raped goes to the police and she tries to report him. They brush her off. He tries to kill Eastwood later as well for it, and it's kind of just like played in the background. It's a very odd dynamic. But obviously this is a film where all of this complete lack of any kind of empathy and humanity just exists. And you talk about just how bad and cruel Eastwood's character is in this. And I mean, he's essentially a monster in every single way. I mean, I think we've all given our opinions on it, so I think we can put in a spoiler warning here.
Spoiler warning.
Just for the ending, because there is a portion of this film that has to be discussed. And that is that one of the most common theories of this film is that this is a ghost movie. It's a haunting. It is a reckoning. It is essentially Eastwood character being the sheriff that was killed a year ago, coming back in a slightly different form. We see flashbacks. The person being killed looks like Eastwood. Apparently, it's not. I genuinely thought, like both times I saw this movie, I thought that was Eastwood. Apparently, it's his body double with makeup to look like him, which shocked me. But that does make sense, since no one actually recognizes him as he rides in. But essentially, this is just revenge. It's repeated revenge, and we don't know it for such a long time. And if we see the film through the sense of Eastwood simply just being this vile, vengeful, hateful spirit, I think the entire tone of the film makes sense. What do you guys think about that theory in general?
So I know Adam and I may kind of differ on opinions on this. I think it is a spiritual kind of revenge. Now, I do think Eastwood intentionally made it vague. I read up on it later that the original script actually had his character being the brother of the marshal that was killed, and Eastwood intentionally removed it to create that sense of mystery, and maybe this is a spiritual demon coming back for vengeance kind of thing. But I am glad he did that, because I think just explicitly saying, oh, he's the brother, kind of robs the film of some of its mystical agency, might be the phrase I would use. But yeah, I like to think he's a really pissed off ghost. or a demon, maybe.
I'm not sure if we'll disagree too much. I know I messaged a couple days, said that I did. I just wrote that, I think, because if you had asked me, I don't know, 20 years ago, I would have said, no, he's definitely not a ghost. What a crazy theory. I don't know why I missed some of the more obvious telltale signs as a kid that this is, perhaps a ghost story, or maybe not a ghost, but some sort of, spiritual or mystical creature. I just know that I always was sort of struck by two things. One is that if this is a ghost, this is an oddly corporeal ghost, a ghost who drinks and sleeps and has sex, which is kind of unusual for a ghost. And then the other thing that Chris said, that, he looks so much like Duncan, so much so to the extent that I always thought that it was Eastwood playing Duncan. I just realized a couple of days ago, as Chris said, that the person playing Duncan is actually Eastwood's stunt double. And as with most stunt doubles, I think they basically slap a wig on them and a little bit of makeup to make them look a tiny bit like the person they're standing in for. I think that's what happened here. I think this is Eastwood's stunt double with an Eastwood wig. So I always grew up thinking Eastwood had played him. So I always thought, oh, he just survived the whipping and he's come back. Now that leads to, why don't they recognize him? Which makes no sense unless we agree that he is sort of a different spirit of some sort. And then there is all these sort of, dialogue about, his soul can't rest and things like that. I'll just read a quote that I found from Eastwood himself. He said in an interview, "I like the irony of doing a stylized version of what happens if the sheriff in High Noon is killed and symbolically comes back as some avenging angel or something." So I'm pretty comfortable going with what Eastwood says. I can think of this character as an avenging angel, maybe not a ghost per se, but some sort of emissary of a higher power sent to seek revenge, to mete out justice to the wicked and the evil. I also think perhaps to some extent it doesn't terribly matter what or who he is, that there's some sort of purposeful ambiguity, and I'm comfortable just living with that ambiguity.
Yeah, I don't think there's much more I can add from what's already been said, but I would certainly say he's some kind of ghost or reincarnation, or I think he's some type of ghost, but there's still some ambiguity about exactly who he is. But definitely there's some sort of ghost type element of it. And I kind of feel like maybe the fact that the character's so kind of evil, comes from the fact that he's no longer human, or is no longer like a proper human. So he doesn't have any kind of cares for some of the things that he does, So I kind of feel like maybe no man could do quite as evil as Clint Eastwood's character did. So I don't know. There's something in there, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, I think you might be on something. Like, all humanity is just squished out of him. And just in terms of the ambiguity, I think there is this final scene. So, like, I think it was American Adam who mentioned that there's all of this talk of Jim Duncan, the sheriff who was killed, soul not being able to rest because he doesn't have a headstone. And then I think there's this actually final scene where his helper, Mordecai, is finally putting up that headstone. And he turns to Eastwood's character as he rides past, and they have this little conversation about it. And Mordecai asks, so you never told me your name? And Eastwood replies back, and it pans over to the tombstone with Jim Duncan's name on it, and Eastwood rides into the horizon, and then he fades away. Not like he rides over the horizon, like he literally just disappears in the horizon in a very ghostly manner. So for me, that seemed pretty clear cut.
Yeah, I would agree. When I saw the ending, it seemed pretty definite. At the very least, it seemed Marshall Duncan did not survive the whipping for sure. He wouldn't need a tombstone otherwise. But yeah, it seemed pretty clear to me that Eastwood was implying heavily that he was of a supernatural origin.
I think we should also mention that he paints the town red, literally, and names it Hell, as the old killers who killed Sheriff Duncan come riding back into town, and then he puts the town on fire. So there's more metaphors and allegories there than usual, let's say, for a Western like this. It sounds like we talked through this film well enough already, so we can jump over to Eastwood's next Western, The Outlaw, Josey Wales, from 1976, just 3 years later, and it's a bit of a different story. And when I saw this, I was actually surprised over how overtly, I would probably call it anti-American in the fullest way, because our hero, Josey Wales, he's a southerner who witnessed the murder of his family, the vicious slaughtering of his family by Union soldiers. And he's been seeking revenge with a group of renegades for probably years at the end of the Civil War. And they're all offered pardons, and they all have to go in to read the Pledge of Allegiance. And he says that he refuses. He's not going to pledge allegiance to America. All of his compatriots go in. He's the one who's going to stand against America, and he rides up. We can probably spoil the part too, that the people who are silly enough to trust America all get slaughtered. And then the film actually takes a very interesting turn. I think it's a book adaptation. It is one that moves from plot to plot in some ways. We get a larger and larger character gallery, and it very much changes as it moves along. And it's an interesting... It's almost like one of those road movies of the modern westerns that Clint Eastwood did, with different kinds of companions. It has a lot more humanity, a lot more optimism than High Plains Drifter. In many ways, it's almost a little bit utopian in a lot of the earnestness that goes on. If there hadn't been for the fact that Indians are seen as superior to the US and those in power, I would probably have said it's the closest thing to a classic era Western we have seen from Eastwood. But there's a lot of touches there. So I would love to hear from you guys on just what do you feel is going on here for Eastwood. Do you think this is a much more mellow version of Western? Is he stepping back on revisionism a little bit? And just how do you guys feel about the Outlaw Josey Wales in general?
Yeah, I love this movie. Maybe not quite as much as High Plains Drifter, and in some ways it is a more sentimental movie. Pretty much every movie is more sentimental compared to High Plains Drifter. But I don't see it really as anti-American. I really see it as an anti-war movie, and a movie about dealing with trauma and moving past war. And there's really, I think, no way to view this as anything other than a post-Vietnam movie. It's very much of its era. It was released in 1976. Vietnam War had concluded only 1 year prior. American involvement in Vietnam had ended 2 years prior. And obviously that was a time of great trauma and many wounded feelings. So when Eastwood says at the end to Fletcher, he says, "I guess we all died a little in that damn war," it's hard not to read it as a commentary on current events. Yeah, so that's my main take on the movie. I do wonder, though, the extent to which it is an optimistic movie, because one thing that occurred to me, I think, for the first time at the end of the movie is when Josey sort of walked away from a potential gunfight with Fletcher. I'm not sure where he goes. I'm not sure if he goes back to his sort of impromptu family, or if he just rides off, as was his original intention, because he feels he can never really truly have a family again.
Oh, that's an interesting take there, Adam. I just thought he would be riding back, but you might very well be right. That does put a darker spin on things.
Yeah, I would say in general it is definitely a more lighthearted film than High Plains Drifter. To Adam's point, it would be hard not to. It has more overt comedy in it. I like his little spit tobacco punchlines. But I think to your point, Chris, it does, to me, I would describe it as a road movie. It's just a road movie with horses instead of cars. Kind of meandering along, meeting people along the way, learning things from them. And I do think he goes back to his family at the end. I think the kind of the arc of the movie is, as he rides along, it's Josey learning to care about people again after having his life destroyed. And I think by the end he walks away because he has something to walk away to. I think if he were in the same place he were at the beginning of the film, it would have just ended in a bloodbath.
That's very well put. And I don't think we want to spoil too much already now. We can bring up some of those things later. But it's absolutely a tale of someone very, very hardened, opening up and being able to trust and possibly even love again. So you have a very, very, very different take than High Plains Drifter. What about you, Scottish Adam? Like, what was your take on the Outlaw Josey Wales?
Yeah, I mean, this was always I first saw this film, I think, when I was a teenager, and this was always one of my favorites. I think I agree with a lot of what Ben said. To me, it's like, I was going to say it's a road movie. It's almost like an emotional journey. The characters sort of going on a journey, and then gradually all these different people like are joining them from different backgrounds and everything. And yeah, it's almost like, although there's a kind of revenge and there's like an emotion, that kind of aspect to it, it's certainly a lighter film than High Plains Drifter was. And there's kind of one-liners. There's some, I think there's very good quotes. It's an easier watch in the sense of it being a little bit lighter. And yeah, I also agree with the kind of optimistic sort of ending of him going back to his family. Yeah, I think it's a real classic film from Clint Eastwood, and one of the more famous ones. Yeah, I found it really, really enjoyable exploring it again and just watching the journey of the film and the character, really.
Yeah, I think that quote, "Dying ain't much of a living," that's it's a pretty famous quote from this movie, and to me it kind of sums up the movie as a whole.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things in this film that stands out is the quotes like that. That's one of the main quotes I would think of. Gives the film, yeah, so it gives something different to the film, even just having these kind of memorable quotes for me anyway.
Oh, yeah, and I was going to add that it's interesting that, Fletcher at the beginning betrays his men, and in any sort of traditional movie, this would be something that would have to be avenged to sort of bring the story, full circle. So the fact that they right off they agree to forget is kind of extraordinary. The other thing that occurred to me during this movie is that post-bellum reconciliation between North and South is a really long-standing theme in Westerns, especially in John Ford Westerns. So the fact that at first there is no reconciliation, that there's just continuing violence, but then at the end it's not reconciliation as much as sort of a very traumatic and regretful, mutual agreement to step aside from violence. I thought that was an interesting variation on a traditional Western theme.
Yeah, and I think you're all pretty much spoiled the ending already, so I'll move I'll move a spoiler warning a little bit earlier there, but I think you're absolutely right. And one of the really interesting part of this film is obviously that the grandmother and granddaughter that Eastwood runs into and starts protecting, they are from the other side. They hate the South, and the son/father was killed by the South. And throughout this narrative, they start to get along with each other. And then obviously they pick up Lone Waity, played by Chief Dan George, in a just fantastic, really hilarious role. Lots of memorable moments throughout, to put it mildly, and I would say he steals a lot of scenes from Eastwood. And there's also a lot of reconciliation between Native Americans and the white people who are not on the side of the government here as well. Like, essentially, the end compromise here is that Eastwood and his new adopted family, they make peace with the Comanches. They are going to live off the land. They're all becoming partners together. It's like almost this utopia where everyone's going to sing Kumbaya in a field, which is not usually what you associate Eastwood with. But as you said, this is a film in so many ways just about coming together. And what you pointed out earlier there, Adam, about being a film very much in its time, very much a commentary of the Vietnam War, which obviously broke America up into two very opinionated sides, that this could be a film commenting on how they should let bygones be bygones and how everyone needs to get together and form new bonds. That makes the film even more important in many ways, and it feels like a film with a lot more to say. And it's also just it's such a lovely sentiment, really, that it's not again what you associate Eastwood westerns with. So a very, very interesting outing for sure.
I'm actually curious about the original book this is based on. Chris, you mentioned it earlier, but the writer of this is kind of a pile of garbage. He wrote it under a pseudonym because he was such a notorious segregationalist and racist. And I'm very curious as to how the book compares to the film, because the film really seems to have kind of a more tolerant view of race relations between whites and Native Americans. And I feel like someone described as such wouldn't have those kind of relationships in the book, but I've never read the book. It's a bit hard to track down, actually.
Yeah, I actually, when I was reading about the film for the podcast episode, I didn't actually know anything about the origins of the book, and it did make me think, it'd be interesting to read it, because you wonder if Clint Eastwood kind of had his own take on the story, and was it him that brought in the more tolerant aspects? Certainly the film version does not seem like something that came from this like awful white supremacist kind of guy. So I'm certainly going to try and find it just to, well, I don't know. In some ways I want to read it. In other ways I don't want to read something written by that guy. But it would be an interesting comparison. And it's certainly interesting to see if Eastwood changed the tone and brought in different elements that make it feel like a more tolerant and like positive kind of story.
Yeah. Well, he's dead, so he's not getting any residuals. So
I think it would be interesting to read it. I just want to note, though, that if someone sort of changed the message from the book to the movie, it may have been not been Eastwood, but it could have been Philip Kaufman. So, I'm a big Kaufman fan. I want to make a plea for his role here, that he is listed as either the writer or co-writer, and he was the original director of the movie. And then halfway through, Eastwood fired him and took over, which doesn't surprise me too much. If Eastwood's going to have a disagreement with the director, he's going to have his way. I'm kind of surprised Eastwood didn't make himself the director from the outset, but it does make me wonder to what extent the finished product, how much of it was directed by Kaufman and how much of it was directed by Eastwood.
Well, I read that the principal photography hadn't started yet when Kaufman was fired. It was just in the planning stages, though he had scouted the location and hired some actors, including Dan George, already. But you might be right with the screenplay for sure. Kaufman could have made some big alterations, and Kaufman is of course known for films that did have, like, he's known for his paranoia films. He's known for his films that kind of are more questioning of, call it, American society, and yeah, I mean, the fact that someone like him could potentially side with Native Americans over the United States government, I could see that. I could see that coming from him more than Eastwood, but you never really know, and it could be from the book as well. I mean, I read that a lot of people say that Forrest Carter, the writer, that they read his book as a way of redeeming himself from his past as well, because he wasn't a segregationist. He was a member of the Ku Klux Klan, a leader in the Ku Klux Klan, something that he was trying to step away from at the end of his life. So it could be that the books he did were severely different. In fact, I read that his later book was, with not knowing who he was, recommended by Oprah Winfrey, which is a very, very odd trivia. Was part of her book club.
Sorry, Chris, just one thing. I was just reading on Wikipedia, which is obviously not the greatest source, but it actually says that Kaufman was less happy with the novel's political stance. He felt it had been written by a crude fascist, and that the man's hatred of government was insane. He also felt that he felt that element of the script needed to be severely toned down, but he later said Clint didn't, and it was his film, and then he was fired. So there was some kind of, I mean, I didn't read the proper article. I'm just reading that on the basis of a couple of lines from Wikipedia. But definitely, yeah. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. Sorry, Chris.
No, that's perfect. I think you got a lot of backstory and context there that interested listeners can continue diving into while we move on to the next film, Bronco Billy, which is, as you said, not a proper Western, but it plays with the Western archetype. This is a proper Western road show. Clint Eastwood is the head honcho. He is Bronco Billy. He's the fastest shooter in the West. A performance artist sporting that cowboy hat. And in a setup that could be straight out of some relatively bad rom-com, really, a rich heiress is abandoned in the middle of nowhere by the husband that married her for her money. She's left destitute, and she ends up becoming Eastwood's new stage assistant with sparks flying, lines and actions that would probably have led to harassment suits in today's climate. And interestingly, a little bit like the world we're brought into in the Outlaw of Josey, Wales, a bit of a bizarre Neverland, a utopia, as we slowly learn in the film that Bronco Billy is essentially a Peter Pan-like figure, finding misfits he runs into and allowing them to become who they always dreamed of. becoming, because at Bronco Billy's you can be anything you want. This is, to me, a bit of a misfire. It's clunky. It feels a little bit all over the place. I'm sure we'll discuss that a little bit later. But there are some absolutely fantastic parts here. It feels a little bit more like a Terry Gilliam movie almost, just missing his types of touches. And it could have been a better film, even a great film with some tweaks. But what do you guys say? Are you, shall we say, outside of the more canonical view that this is one of Eastwood's lesser films?
So I wouldn't say it's a great film. To your point, it does meander a lot. There isn't really a strong through line to the plot. I do feel like Clint Eastwood is probably not the right director or star for this kind of movie. Gilliam could be interesting, but even somebody like Sidney Pollack might work better to kind of tighten it up. I don't know. It reminds me of Elmer Gantry, but with a lot less cohesiveness to its central theme. It almost feels like an anti-Western. You know, it sets forth these archetypes of what a Western cowboy should be and then proceeds to dismantle them. You know, they even attempt that train robbery at one point, and it just fails miserably because they don't know what they're doing, and trains don't work that way anymore.
Oh, yes.
But, you know, so it's not a bad movie. I was entertained by it, but it's definitely not one of Eastwood's better films.
Yeah, I probably agree with that. I enjoyed it quite a bit too, and there are some great moments sprinkled throughout as well. What about you, American Adam, as the Eastwood superfan in a lot of ways? How did you react to Bronco Billy?
Sorry, got to sit this one out. I didn't have time to see Bronco Billy this week. I was rewatching all the others.
Oh, wow. This is actually a blind spot completely. I thought you had seen it years ago, at least.
No, it is definitely a blind spot. I'll have to get to it soon.
Well, like we said, it's probably not the biggest priority, but at least you have some Eastwood left in you. And he does have a fast shootout there. What about you then, Scottish Adam? What's your reaction to Bronco Billy?
Well, I mean, I liked the film a little bit more than I remembered, but absolutely one of the weaker ones. I mean, if you look at Eastwood's filmography, I mean, most of these were not as a director, but if you look kind of late 70s, early 80s, it's kind of an era of lesser known Eastwood films or ones of lesser acclaim. Like, for example, you know, you've got Every Which Way But Loose, Any Which Way You Can. I know they were like big hits, but personally, I don't like them. And then you've got like ones like City Heat, which was really, really bad film. And it came in a kind of, I mean, you've got Escape from Alcatraz, which was obviously a big hit, critically acclaimed, but it was a kind of era of, there was some comedy films, there was some weaker ones that's a bit lesser known. And then like Bronco Billy itself, yeah, it's like entertaining enough as a light kind of comedy, but absolutely for me, one of the weaker films. I wasn't a big fan of like Sandra Locke, for example, I in that film, and I think what Ben said about Eastwood probably being the wrong director and actor is probably a fair point. It's just kind of yeah, I can't quite find out. Wait, it's quite. I don't think the humor is great in it. I just think it's a light and fairly forgettable film. I may be being like a little bit harsh, but it really came in an era. I mean, obviously we'll talk about Honkytonk Man later, which I liked a lot, but it came in an era with quite a few weaker films. Some of the films are really light and comedies, and it's almost like he was going for a different style for a while. But yeah, I mean, there's some merits just to it being a slightly kind of light, fun type film, but I don't think it works particularly well. So it's certainly not one of my favorites, that's for sure.
Yeah, we were talking it over after we were watching it, or in my case, seeing it for the first time as well. And yeah, Sandra Locke was not exactly fantastic in this film. And Eastwood, honestly, I think he could have done this even better. I think like he does actually have a charm about him here as this dreamer. Like, I think that reveal late in the middle of the film that, you know, he doesn't have a background as a gun shooter. Like I think he was an accountant until he was in his mid-30s for a very boring job, you know, and you get this, like, I think he actually manages to embody that fairly well. I think one of the big issues with the film, in my mind, is that it tries to, at one point, be kind of this big, semi-wholesome, semi-fantasy, semi-dreamlike, semi-accepting, you can be whatever you want to be story. And that's, like, say, that all this posturing, etc., that's just for play and for fun. But then at the same time, it does, for a large part of the film, really play into that as well, play into that old style, play into all of Eastwood's machismo, all of that, the weird behavior, very off behavior towards his female lead. I think those things kind of rub against each other, and maybe it's just because it's a film from a slightly different era as well, but all other films don't really have those kinds of problems. And as all of you said, it has pacing issues. It is a bit all over the place. It doesn't have that big cohesive vision. For me, it doesn't fully work. And I don't even think we need to spoil the ending here, because the ending doesn't even have that big a punch. So with that, I think we can actually move on to a film that I actually think is one of Eastwood's best. And some of you might fight me on that a little bit, but it is Honkytonk Man from 1982. Once again, a road movie. It's set not in modern day, but in the 30s. It's about a alcoholic singer that's wanting to make his way to Nashville and get his big break after all of these years, and a nephew that looks up to him. We travel the Old West, go into those honky-tonks, we hear Eastwood sing, and damn, he is actually a pretty damn good singer.
Is he, though?
All right, we can disagree on that too. I mean, I know one of his songs were nominated for a Razzie here, so maybe not. But he has that folk singer, country singer vibe to his voice. He does all right, in my opinion. So, I was surprised about how well he sang. I figured he would use a different singer and just do sync up. I was impressed. Maybe you weren't. I mean, it's not the most polished in the world, but anyways, this is once again a story of fantasy. It's once again a film with different characters sliding in along the way, and it's once again a story about an older Clint Eastwood taking a boy under his wing, which, actually no, that we saw that in Out of Those Two Wells. We didn't really comment on it that much there. It was a portion of Bronco Billy as well, but though both of these cases we're talking about young men rather than, in this case, a teenager/child. I think he's 12, the boy. Also, by the way, played by Eastwood's own son. This is Kyle Eastwood. This is, in many ways, a very classically directed film. I was very impressed by how I felt Eastwood's direction had progressed. I think he's able to let us feel things he would previously just show. But it's not an overly well received film. So I'm going to get a little bit of support here before I get to the Americans, because I know that Scottish Adam is a fan of Honkytonk Man as well. So before we get some potential negativity, I want to hear from you. What are your feelings about Honkytonk Man?
Yeah, I guess I kind of spoke earlier about how that era had some weaker films, and Honkytonk Man is certainly one of the lesser known ones. I watched it a few years ago, and I think it's a very good film. I think it wasn't quite as good on the second watch as I remembered it, because I think the first time I watched it, I had no expectations at all. This time I had a lot higher ones, but I think it worked well. I think one thing you said about Bronco Billy was it was trying to be so many different types of films at once. I think Honky-Tonk Man is quite simply a kind of road movie. It's about Kyle Eastwood, the boy in the film, kind of looking up to and learning from Clint Eastwood. There's a lot of heart to it. There's I just think it works great, and it's kind of Clint Eastwood does very well in it. The directing, the acting. I think even Kyle Eastwood, does a good job considering his age. And something about it for me, the heart of the film, I just kind of bought into. And I'd say it's certainly one of the better films of that era, where there's quite a lot of weak films. That's one of the bright sparks of this sort of lesser known Eastwood films. And I think, the singing, I'm going to agree with Chris that I don't think he's a brilliant singer, but I think it works, for what he's doing, it works. I don't think he's some incredible singer who could have been a massive hit, but I think it works. And the whole film just works for me. The whole feel of it, for some reason. I really rate the film in a way that Bronco Billy felt really disjointed, and Honky-Tonk Man just feels quite just feels like a nice little film, really.
Yeah, I agree. I really like how you connected to Bronco Billy in saying that Bronco Billy was trying to do so many different things at the same time. It was kind of all over the place, and this film kind of takes that more fantastical, but that humanism and the dreaming of Bronco Billy, and it simplifies it into a very straightforward road movie. We have a core duo with some side characters along the way. And that's where most of the heart and emotion come from. And I agree, this is a film with so much heart. The acting can be a little bit wooden at times, but like you said, like especially for his age, Clint Eastwood is very good in it. And it just feels like such a classic story. Like 40 years earlier, this could have been a John Ford kind of film. You know, you have all of these very classic components. It feels of its age, and it feels like a very lived-in world. You go into these honky tonks, and you kind of get on that level. And I think one of the reasons why I stand out in Eastwood's filmography for me too is it feels that little bit different. Just there has that heart and soul in so many ways, and it largely feels very, very genuine. It's non-flinching classical film. So while it went down a little bit for me too on rewatch, like you said, I think just how ignored this film is, and just how low your expectation of it is when you go into it probably boosts it up. But I still thoroughly enjoyed it, and I just love the central duo and just the atmosphere it manages to convey. So with us two having our say, let's bring it over to the Americans. What's your reaction to Honkytonk Man?
So I would actually mostly agree with you. I did like it quite a bit. I tend to gravitate to road movies. I kind of like just the easygoing vibe of them a lot of times, even when it's dealing with more heavy subject matter, like a man dying of tuberculosis. But honestly, my biggest hang up with this is more tied to me being a big music fan and understanding a lot of the history behind this and when it was supposed to have taken place and who it was based on and everything. So a bit of history. So this is based on very, very, very loosely based on Jimmie Rodgers, who was kind of the father of country music back during the Great Depression. Eastwood, for his style of singing, that's not the kind of singer you would have heard back in the 1930s. That especially one that people would be like, oh no, this is a guy that we need to hear and record. This is good stuff. Like his style of singing is much more in tune with like 1960s kind of country folk type of singing. Jimmie Rodgers was known for his kind of brash yodeling technique. He was the blue yodeler, and Eastwood is absolutely nothing like that at all. And you can actually, there's that scene toward the end when he's recording and then he starts falling into fits, and his backing guitarist Smokey takes over. That Smokey's played by Marty Robbins, who is, a very influential, very well-known country singer from the 1950s onwards. And just, you can tell, okay, this is a real country singer who is taken over. And that kind of thing takes me out of it when Smokey takes over and the producer doesn't react like, oh, now this guy's got it. Because Eastwood just isn't convincing to me as a country singer. That was my main issue with it. The relationship between him and his nephew, though, I thought felt real enough. I bought it. I do think the film teeters a little too hard in the sentimentality toward the end. But overall, I did like it. I get hung up on the music aspect of it.
I just wanted to say one thing. I think that's really interesting to hear the sort of musical history of that time. I think I benefited from not knowing any of that. Even if it was intended this way, I did not interpret the film as Clint Eastwood being like this amazing singer. I interpreted it as him being kind of like a failed singer who at the end of his life got to record some hits, and almost like they were just taking sympathy on him because he was towards the end of his life. I mean, that might not be at all what was intended, but maybe that's why it worked for me, is I can see why if you knew more about that time or what they were going for, it might damage it. But yeah, I certainly didn't have any interpretation of him being an amazing singer at all. And I think that made me enjoy the film a lot more.
Yeah, no, I'll just agree with that. And I had no idea about that connection either. And if I thought that they were trying to portray him as an absolutely fantastic singer, I probably wouldn't have given him the compliment I gave earlier. I don't think they took pity on him. So I think he had written some good songs. I think he was performing them well. And I'm not a country fan, so I don't know. I'm more into folk. So like a lot of singers in folk have very raspy voices. So, if you put this guy out in that kind of area, that would work for me, So I just thought this is a guy, he has an adequate voice He wrote some really nice songs, and one of them might become a hit, and it's going to be a decent album. That's all I thought. I didn't think that this was going to be like a revolution or something. So if that's what the film was going for, it severely failed.
Yeah, it's just based on some of the reactions from some people a couple of times during the movie. It felt like it was an overreaction based on his actual skill. Like I don't think someone with that kind of skill during that time period would have even been given an opportunity to record whether he was dying of tuberculosis or not. Which is actually what happened with Jimmie Rodgers. He died young of tuberculosis. His last recordings were made while he was dying, and he did have to like pause recording to go, hack up blood and come back. So it was an interesting, sad kind of connection there.
What was also interesting was that one of the Eastwood songs was actually written for I Check Movies, No Sweeter Cheater Than You. So that's an unknown fact.
That's a reference, by the way, to the website I Check Movies, where there are some people who just literally, for reasons we have no idea, set up fake accounts and just check everything for no apparent reason. We still don't know why.
I don't know. Some people just like to click buttons for no reason. There's that whole gotcha game one that's built a multi-million-dollar industry off of it.
Very good. So I think with that we got the Honkytonk Man out of our system, and Adam and I learned something new as well. So thank you for that, Ben. And with that, we're moving on to a real Western again. Pale Rider, which once again sees Eastwood as a stranger riding into a town. But this time, he's not really vindictive. He's more of a straightforward hero, helping the downtrodden and becoming their champion, even if you can see that there's something else under the surface. And since he hasn't talked a lot, I would love to just put this over to American Adam, because I know he wants to talk about some connections to another film we actually did an episode on in the past.
Yeah, so this is clearly a Shane remake, as I think anyone who has seen Shane can tell. The broad outlines of the plot are basically the same, and many of the incidents and scenarios within the plot are the same. There are a couple of differences. The whole preacher angle is new. It's California instead of Wyoming. It's mining instead of ranching, but most everything else is the same. I have to admit, I find this movie pretty disappointing. I was disappointed when I saw it as a kid, and I was disappointed upon rewatch. I imagine some of you feel differently. For me, it is disappointing, first of all, because, coming after Jersey Whales and High Plains Drifter, which I think are great movies, this felt lesser. It's disappointing because there's an obvious comparison to be made with Shane, which is, in my opinion, not only one of the best Westerns ever made, but one of the best movies ever made. And I really have to wonder what Eastwood thought he was adding here or doing differently that warranted a remake. The additions, like the preacher angle, I don't know what the purpose of it is. I don't really know what it brings to us. And the whole thing feels a little too easy and too familiar to me. It feels almost like Eastwood is doing a haphazard imitation of a previous Eastwood movie than that he's actually doing something interesting and new. So I was a bit disappointed with Pale Rider.
That's some mild condemnation there, Adam. And yeah, no, I completely agree with you. And especially after you pointed it out to me ahead of rewatching it, I was paying attention. And yeah, there's so few real changes. Like the boy becomes a slightly older girl and she has a crush on him instead of just adoring him, for instance. Like there's just these small tweaks. Like it's not an official remake, by the way. It's just plagiarism, essentially. I mean, granted, this is very, very familiar area. I mean, there's an entire subgenre of westerns with stranger rides into town, or stranger takes on the cattle barons, stranger takes on the rich guy in town, stranger protects prospector, stranger protects XYZ. That exists. I don't think it's accidental, but it could have been that Eastwood just had seen Shane so many times, loved Shane, and giving him the benefit of the doubt, just didn't realize just how much he was ripping off here. But the potential love interest with the wife/fiance, the friendship with the husband, the adoring kid, bad guy trying to take them over, the plot the henchman with the past history with him coming in late in the movie. Like, it's literally just following step by step by step. So yeah, it's surprising. Like, maybe just didn't want to buy the rights, but it's just, wow, it's just so damn close.
Yeah, it is pretty blatant. I will say some of the changes he made seem to just make it a little creepier than Shane. Adding in an attempted rape, adding in the 14-year-old crush on Eastwood, adding in a supernatural angle, which that's something else to mention. This is the only Western Eastwood has been openly candid about. Yes, the preacher is a ghost. There are a couple of scenes.
Damn, I thought it was mysterious. Okay.
No. Eastwood has said in interviews, yes, this is my only film I have made where the lead character is supernatural. And the movie is a little vague about it, but Eastwood himself has said, no, he's totally a ghost. Why he made him a ghost? I mean, it doesn't really contribute to the movie in any major way, in my opinion. It just makes him a little more mysterious. But, honestly, my favorite part of this movie is, I think, Michael Moriarty's character. I think Michael Moriarty is a very underrated character actor, and he's just great in just about everything he's in. And I feel like he adds a lot of heart and gravitas to a role that really could be completely thankless in other hands.
Yeah, I'll just jump in to say that I also occurred to me that the preacher is a ghost, simply on the basis of that he had evidently been shot 6 times through the chest at some point earlier in his life, and it's difficult to imagine someone surviving that with the benefit of 19th century medicine.
Yeah, the guy said, like, oh, I thought you were dead. Like, we killed you, or something like that.
Yeah. There's also the whole Book of Revelation reference in the title, and then the girl's reading from the Book of Revelation when he shows up, and that's how we get the Pale Rider title, which adds that sort of supernatural, mystical element. And it's another case where I don't really think it does much for the movie other than provide the title.
Yeah, to me, High Plains Drifter, it's much more warranted and makes it a more interesting movie. But in Pale Rider, it really just doesn't add much of anything. He could have easily just been a benevolent preacher who wants to help people.
Yeah, I can't imagine anyone other than Eastwood was sitting around thinking, what if in Shane had been a ghost? No one, that occurred to no one other than Clint Eastwood.
Yeah, you're very, very right there. I mean, I don't really think it adds much at all, but it's much vaguer than High Plains Drifter to me. And if Eastwood said this is the only one where it's a ghost, that's even more confusing. Like, again, this could be a guy who just survived being shot 6 times, even though it is hard to believe. There aren't all those clues except for the reading from the Bible that he mentioned. But yeah, no, it's there. If that's his intention, it's there. Is once again, I suppose, a vengeful, or this time a helpful spirit prowling about. American Adam already talked about how he was disappointed by the film. I was a bit disappointed by the film as well. I think it pales a bit in comparison to Shane, which I'm not as big a fan of as...
was that pun intended?
Pales in comparison to Shane? I'll say it was. I'll say it was. But yeah, no, I mean, it's just, when you have this, especially since it's not an official remake, you just look at it, it's like, it feels too familiar. If it hadn't been for these minor touches, like, this is a classic Western. It's even more of a classic Western than Shane in a lot of ways, because in Shane, you have this central message that violence isn't necessarily the answer. You have this message that, someone who commits violence can't really be part of a community. That's one of the common readings of it. It's like a proto-revisionist classical Western. And there's no real message here in the same way. It's just, this is a helpful stranger who comes in, he saves the day. It's a bit more violent, probably, than the classical Westerns. You have that rape thrown in there. You have that slightly awkward romance where a 14-year-old girl really wants to marry Eastwood and says, I'll be 15 next year. That is okay. Like, it's... and he's obviously being a nice guy, putting her off. But, like, he wrote that in for himself. So it's a lesser Eastwood, to put it like that. I enjoy it. I think it's better than Bronco Billy by a mile. But it's not one of his best.
Yeah, I mean, of the main 4, like Outlaw, Josey, Unforgiven, High Plains Drifter, Pale Rider. I mean, I think Pale Rider is undoubtedly the weakest. I think I enjoyed it more than everyone else because I haven't seen a huge amount of Westerns. So I wasn't really watching it thinking, oh, this is the same as Shane or this is like a kind of rip-off. So I think my lack of knowledge on the genre in general probably makes the film more enjoyable for me. But it's undoubtedly, like, it's easily the weakest of the four. And I mean, I watched the film thinking it was clear that Eastwood's character was a ghost based on like the bullet wounds and other things. But like everyone else said, I don't think it really mattered or added a lot to the plot. It's certainly not as strong as the other three, but it's ahead of Bronco Billy, that's for sure.
And yeah, just be clear, I did like The Elevator quite a bit. It's a pretty damn good movie, even though it has all of these flaws. And the final shootout, and I think we've gotten at this so far without really spoiling the endings. We don't have to spoil it, we can leave this open. But the final shootout with, all of the henchmen wearing the same coats, that whole chase to the village. Like, I think that's a pretty damn iconic final battle as well, and the one that definitely elevates the film a bit in my eyes. But if no one else has anything more to add about Pale Rider, I think we can move from what we all seem to agree is the weakest of the four proper westerns to what I assume that we'll see. Maybe someone will favor High Plains Drifter, but at least I think, as I mentioned earlier, is Eastwood's best western and possibly the best western of all time. Certainly top three for me. Unforgiven, which is a completely different direction on revisionism. Adam from New York, our very own American Adam, said earlier that High Plains Drifter took the revisionism as far as it could go. I think Unforgiven took it in a very different direction, where High Plains Drifter is just mean and ugly. Unforgiven looks more at the melancholy, inner turmoil, living with yourself after you've done something bad. Like, it's the idea that killing a man can be genuinely hard, and if you manage, it's gonna haunt you. It's just a completely different take, and it's just also filled with such huge amount of grey. Eastwood's anti-hero is, for all intents and purposes, a hired gun, a mercenary, heading up to kill some boys who sliced up a prostitute. And it should be noted, for some added grayness here, only one of them actually did it. The other guy tried to stop him, and he's still gonna get killed for it. The sheriff there, played by Gene Hackman in probably one of his most memorable roles, is really just trying to keep peace in the town, but is also a very violent man. And you also get Morgan Freeman as an excellent sidekick to Eastwood here, as an old gang member who did a lot of bad stuff with him in the past, but like Eastwood may have changed. And you also just get a hilarious and fantastic role from Richard Harris as English Bob, another hitman and gunslinger out on the prowl for the same target. And I think it's a film that's worth expectations quite a bit. It's a film that reverses a lot of roles. We're rooting for the hired killer, not the sheriff. At least most people in the audience probably are. And it's also a film that's very much just, like, because we talked about the glamour of the West, it's a film that's very much about these old figures who have done violent things, trying to maintain that illusion. Both English Bob and Gene Hackman's character, Little Bill Daggett, are people who like to talk about and bolster about their old adventures, because they are in many ways iconic. There's some of the few that survived, which is in contrast to Eastwood's character, who overall doesn't really want to talk about it and is more haunted with remorse. But there's also this possibility that he could still be the same bad man underneath. So I think I've talked enough. I'll get in on the action later. I love this film, but let's hear from you guys. Is there anyone here who doesn't think that Unforgiven is Eastwood's best Western? No, then. In that case, I'll start it off with our friend American Adam.
Yeah. I don't know if I need to rank them, but it's an incredible movie. One of the all-time great Westerns. And as you said, it sort of subverts expectations from the beginning, and especially in terms of Eastwood's character. The only thing he has in common with all the other Western heroes or anti-heroes he's played is that he's sort of a man haunted by regrets and trauma. So you can see some Josey Wales in that. But other than that, it's an original sort of character he's playing. It's different from anything he's done before, at least in Westerns, because he's playing basically a beaten down man who looks utterly ridiculous and foolish for much of the movie. He's a man who can't even get on his horse. Beginning of the movie, he very clearly cannot shoot his gun accurately. And then his first showdown with Little Bill, I mean, he's made a total fool. And is beaten harshly for it. He has no idea what he's doing. And even, when that changes over the final section of the story where you could say he gets his killing habits back, and he seems like more of a capable gunman, he still looks awful because now he's betraying his own conscience and betraying the memory of his wife. So it's very much another anti-hero, a character who walks away triumphant in sort of a minor way, but walks away very much a failure in a larger sense. And that's one of the great things about this movie is seeing this character played by Eastwood and played in against type and seeing his development over the course of the movie.
Yeah, going into this, it had been a long time since I had seen Unforgiven, and going into a rewatch, I was thinking, well, I'm not sure how well this is going to hold up. Is this going to be one of those instances like The Searchers where everyone says they love it, but then on a rewatch, it's really not that great? But honestly, it holds up fantastically. It is a very great movie. One thing I found interesting on the rewatch is, thinking about the Saul Rubinek character, the writer, and he, through the whole movie, he basically seems kind of like the audience surrogate, right? Of watching him build up the myth of the West and then see it systematically taken down right in front of his eyes. Every time he rides in with English Bob with this impression that English Bob is this amazing gunman who's brave and fantastic shot, only for Gene Hackman to completely tear him down and show him what a coward he is. And then he starts to latch on to Gene Hackman and, build him up as this amazing, noble character. And then as he sees Gene Hackman whipping, Morgan Freeman to death and his sadism.
Well, that's a little bit less spoilers.
Well, honestly, I think this episode, we just need to put a big spoiler warning on the whole thing. We've taken opinions of nearly every movie. It seems pointless to try to avoid spoilers. And then, he sees Gene Hackman's character torn down right in front of him. And then he just kind of starts to latch on to Clint Eastwood at the end. And, you can kind of see reflected in him the audience's desire to want to build up these people into something they're not. At least with Eastwood, we've already seen he is not the character that Saul Rubinek thinks he is. And so, it's just, we leave with knowing, okay, the West was not a good place. It is not a place to be romanticized.
Pretty powerful words, and that's a fantastic assessment of Saul Rubinek's W.W. Beauchamp's character and journey throughout. I didn't fully think of him as the audience stand-in just because of how, shall we say, cowardly and mocked he is throughout portions of the film. But you might very well be spot on there, yeah.
You were in that situation, would you be closer to Eastwood or closer to Saul Rubinek? I think the Alvin would probably be pretty terrified of getting gunned down in a gritty hellscape.
Probably. So I think you are spot on. I think they're showing us just how terrifying each of these men are, how horrible it would be to be in the West. So yeah, like this is like a wake up call or like a scare straight kind of scenario. I don't know, but well spotted. And I think you like the way you're describing him latching on from character to character and seeing his illusion be destroyed each time. It's something that I hadn't fully thought about. I think it gives the film an even higher star in my mind. It's just how completely the West is torn down in that way. It's an absolutely incredible deconstruction.
Yeah, this aspect of mythologizing and then demythologizing the West is perhaps the other big thing that really appeals to me about this movie. And in some ways, it's kind of a meta-Western. It's a Western that explores the construction of Western, and this is how the Western began, right? With these sort of cheap dime novels of the 19th century, which were extremely popular at the time and were widely available. So to see that sort of depicted and explored in a rather scornful way is the other really fascinating part of this movie for me.
High Plains Drifter is almost like, I'm going to burn down the Western. To me, it's almost not even revisionist. It's almost an anti-Western. It's almost like spitting in the eye of anybody who likes Westerns and looks up to them in a meaningful way. Whereas Unforgiven really does seem like a pure revisionist Western. This is how it really was. There are no heroes. There are just people doing what they do, and some things they do are crappy. Some are seemingly virtuous, but for dubious reasons. And, it feels more real because of that.
Yeah, and one of the things I really appreciate about that is, and this is sort of one of the main themes in the movie, is that what sets apart a gunslinger isn't really skill with a gun, it's willingness to kill. And that's one of the great themes for Eastwood's character, for the Schofield kid, and even for Morgan Freeman's character, is that it takes a lot to be willing to kill someone. And that's what really sets aside a gunslinger, and it's not skill with a gun. I mean, at the end, we had this great dialogue between Eastwood and Rubenek where he's asking him why he shoot the guys in what order. And Eastwood's like, I was lucky, they're just random, which is an interesting comparison to a scene in Josey Wales, where Josey is asked why he shot a bunch of Union soldiers in a certain order, and he had this very sort of complicated explanation of how I knew which one was the most dangerous. This scene between Eastwood and Rubenek where he says, I was lucky, seems kind of sort of a response to that.
That's a great point, a great connection that I didn't think about. I remember that scene in Josey Wales where he had exactly this person was most likely to pull the trigger. This other one I didn't have to worry about because I could see he was scared. All of this thorough assessment and just pure luck. What about you, Scottish Adam? Would you have been Saul Rubenek's character if you had been transported into this world?
Yeah, I think it's difficult to say that you would be someone else. Although hopefully I wouldn't be wetting myself like he did. Yeah, honestly, I think Adam and Ben spoke so well and in so much detail about the whole film. Not the whole film, but about the film overall. I'm not sure I can add anything without repeating them. I mean, I think for me it's easily the best. Oh, sorry, I'm just reading American Adam saying he would have been Clint Eastwood, only cooler and more dangerous if he lived in the Old West. But I guess that's what separates me as Scottish from the Americans on the podcast. But yeah, for me, I think Unforgiven is easily the best of, in fact, the more I watch it, the better it gets. And I think it's easily the best of the films that we've discussed today. I think it's probably even Clint Eastwood's best, film as a director. I'd have to maybe rewatch some of them, but I think arguably it's his best film that he's made in his whole career. And yeah, I just think everything was amazing about it. The cast, the plot, what Adam and Ben have discussed about kind of characters are very flawed. All the characters are built up and then destroyed. There's not really a hero of the film like there might be in a lot of westerns. Yeah, and then having one character there, the writer, as a kind of audience as well. I think it was just, yeah, and I also like was already said, the part where he says, yeah, the whole message about it being about who's willing to kill rather than who's the best shooter. It's just, I think there's nothing about the film that I don't like. So yeah, I just don't think there's much more to add. And I'm looking forward to seeing American Adam, hopefully in a Western in the future in the style of Clint Eastwood. So you can follow on. We can have a podcast about that as well. So that should be good.
Yeah, I'm absolutely ready to take up the mantle of Eastwood in Westerns once he finally does retire. So, at some point in the future, we'll have the Adam Westerns podcast episode.
We could maybe have a remake of Shane, which Adam could star in since there hasn't been one so far.
Absolutely. The twist here will be the Shane is from New York.
Ooh.
And a ghost.
Yeah, a ghost.
A New York ghost. Yeah, Adam mentioned Eastwood's directing, which oddly enough, for an episode about Clint Eastwood's directorial outings, we've talked very little about Eastwood as a director. But I do think I would agree that Unforgiven is one of his most well-directed films. It has a very fluid kind of feel to it. And Jack Green, his longtime cinematographer, I think puts in some of his best work. There are a lot of really nice broad vista shots, and he knows how to draw attention to the right things at the right time, which sounds easy, but is a lot harder than it should be in practice. for a lot of cinematographers. And one thing that always interested me about Eastwood as a director, when I had read up on him a while back, he's fond of doing very few takes. He's one of these 1 or 2 takes and let's move on kind of directors. And, you know, that he gets such control over the characters with such a limited shooting schedule, to me, is pretty impressive. I think a lot of his films do kind of suffer from that approach. They come across very, you know, workmanlike and by the book, very kind of bland visually. But every once in a while, you can really tell he, like with Unforgiven, I feel like he really was invested in making this movie as good as possible. And I think it shows.
Yeah, I think you're completely right there, Ben. And I didn't even realize it was the same director of photography he's been working with on the other film. I figured if it had to be someone completely different, because those opening shots, for instance, probably some of the most beautiful visuals that Eastwood have ever put together, and it looks strong throughout. Though again, like you said, Ben, it has that effective quality to it. It's not overly stylized. It's not Sergio Leone, but it's thoroughly well done, thoroughly well constructed. And you can really feel like, especially when you compare this to something like Pale Rider, which feels a bit drabber, or if you go back to High Plains Drifter, which feels like a movie that's very rough around the edges. Like, yeah, obviously an early directorial effort, but much more rough around the edges. That probably fits very well with just the kind of atmosphere it's going for as well. But here, everything is really just synced in. And I think, as I mentioned earlier, Eastwood had been saving this script. He knew this would be his last Western, at least last proper Western, since we're talking about Cry Macho next. And he wanted to save it, and I think you can feel that in every frame. You can feel that throughout the film, that he's putting in his all. And I completely agree with you, Scottish Adam. This is his best film, and it's just an absolutely fantastic film. Like I said, to me, masterpiece, one of the 3 best Westerns ever made.
Yeah, Jack Green was actually was a camera operator on Pale Rider. Like he had worked on a lot of Eastwood's films up until Heartbreak Ridge, where Eastwood basically promoted him to director of photography, and worked with him, I don't know, all the way into the 2000s. I know at some point they had a rift and kind of went their separate ways, but he stuck with him quite a long time. Looks like maybe Space Cowboys was his last movie with him.
Yeah, Eastwood tends to hold on to a lot of the people he works with for long periods of time. I noticed, for example, Anthony James, who played one of the Carlin brothers in High Plains Drifter, shows up in Unforgiven as Skinny, the proprietor of the brothel. So it's actors often reappearing in Eastwood movies. And then, yeah, staff. I know, like, production designer Harry Bumstead did like 20 Eastwood movies. Jack Green. And this is one of Eastwood's talents as a filmmaker, is he's not just the director on many of his movies, he's almost always the producer of the movies he also directs. So part of his skill, I think, is finding the right people to work on his movies. And it's why I think, you know, Ben used the term workmanlike. I think people often have difficulty, I certainly have difficulty describing Eastwood stylistically. And that's because, you know, he's a guy and he said this multiple times in interviews, he's dedicated above all to narrative over style. Now, of course, there's no such thing as not having a style. Even, you know, a style that is showy or that takes a back step to narrative is still a style. But, you know, he prefers to center the narrative and try to keep the directorial flourishes, the style, something that serves the narrative rather than leads the narrative.
Yeah, that's true. A lot of people always associate auteurism with visual style, but really, you know, to me, as long as you have a cohesive body of work, which I think Eastwood does, he strikes a certain tone in a lot of his films. And a lot of it is, I think, due to the fact that he does use a lot of the same cast and crew from movie to movie. I think that's part of the reason why he can get away with just 1 or 2 takes. They have a shorthand. They know what he wants and are able to deliver it very quickly. And, you know, he's incredibly prolific because of that. It seems like he's been putting out a movie nearly every year since the early 80s, which is a remarkable pace. And the fact that, you know, at least half of them are good to great is pretty impressive.
Yeah, very, very right. And I think I agree with you that it's very hard to describe Eastwood's directorial style. Like you said, there's no real visual elements. It might really just be that workmanlike efficiency, the type of stories he chooses, how he films them. I mean, the films we talked about today, and there's one more coming up, like they have fairly different atmospheres. High Plains Drifters and Josey Wales, those two films alone is a pretty big jump, with High Plains Drifter feeling a little bit more like a spaghetti western, a little bit rougher around the edges, raw hate seeping through the frame, while Outlaw Josey Wales suddenly coming in there feeling a lot more classically directed. And then, his career flips. Like, some of his films are fairly visual, like Types of Our Fathers and Letters from Iwo Jima. Those films are very stunningly visual. There's a lot of great shots in those films. And he could do those as well. But yeah, no, you're absolutely right. For an episode about Clint Eastwood, the director, we're not really talking enough about him as a director. And that's definitely a flaw that our listeners can come in and criticize us for. But I think that this might be a good moment to move to the final film that we're discussing today, Cry Macho, which Eastwood made and starred in while he was in his 90s. I think it was 1991 during the shooting. When it was released while he was 91, probably shot when he was 90. His physique is definitely somewhat frail, but damn, I mean, he's keeping good. He's in punch-ups. I mean, he's significantly older than Robert De Niro. This is after, that infamous Irishman stuff with the motion capture. And I think while his fighting is a bit more wooden, he's there, he's in it. Like I said earlier, this film has a lot of callbacks to the other films we talked about here today, especially Honkytonk Man, because once again, you have a man and a teenager on the road, classic cars mostly. It's set around 40 years ago, so similar kind of time frame jump. We're getting back for Honkytonk Man. It's about a West that's disappearing. We follow an old cowhand, a rodeo rider, old cowboy. He's been fired. He's living fairly destitute, and he's this relatively frail-looking man who's been sent to get the son of his that's not really a friend, ex-boss, like whatever you want to call it, his benefactor. He just takes it on, and he's essentially just becomes this, not gun for hire, but helper for hire, as he makes his way to Mexico. And this son is not, this young innocent boy he sees in the picture. He's out there cockfighting. He's out there trying to be all macho. And he also has a very toxic home life with his extremely wealthy mother. I thought, once again, like you said, like directorially, it feels efficient. It feels a little workmanlike, but it's terribly well done. I like this movie a lot better than I thought I would. I mean, it has a 5.7 on IMDb. I would say this is a thoroughly good movie, though there are some rather weird things here. For instance, where women probably 40, 50, 60 years younger than Eastwood seem to be throwing themselves at him, and him, this relatively frail 90-year-old man, refusing. That's one of the oddest, like that scene with the boy's mother trying to seduce him. Like, that feels like a callback almost to Pale Rider, where this 14-year-old girl is in love with him. He's like mildly declining. It's such a weird scene. When I see Adam in the chat here, Scottish Adam in the chat here, is saying that might just be very close to home given his amount of children and love life as well. So you never know. Maybe that just feels natural for Eastwood. He never even thought about it in the script. But there are some things that are a little bit odd there. I don't think it's as weighty as some of his other films, but I think as a film that kind of just looks back at the types of roles that Eastwood has had, the type of machismo he's had, and showing him in this more frail, older age, looking back, I think it's it could have been a powerful final acting performance. It might be his final acting performance. It's obviously not his last directorial outing because he has a new movie coming out. But if this is his final lead role, it's a very nice sort of homage to everything he's represented in his past.
It's interesting because Cry Macho, it feels like a movie made for Eastwood, but apparently they were going to make it back in 1991 with Roy Scheider, and then in 2011 they were going to make it with Arnold Schwarzenegger. Both fell through.
That's just weird.
I honestly cannot imagine this movie with Arnold in it. That would have felt wildly inappropriate for a lot of reasons.
Because he's too young. We need to wait till Arnold is 90 to play this role.
Yeah, it was going to be like his acting comeback role after being governor, and it just fell through during production. But yeah, that seems bizarre to me. This movie, it really does seem like a summation of Eastwood as the actor, to the point that like I if you had told me, yes, this movie was written for Eastwood, I would have believed you. But it obviously wasn't. It's a script that's been kicking around for 30 years, nearly 40 years. So that, it's 5.7 seems ridiculously low. I wonder if that's like some kind of internet troll thing based on something Eastwood said at the time the movie came out. He tends to be kind of outspoken politically sometimes. It's a competent movie. It really doesn't stand out to me in any major way other than just acting as a kind of period onto his career as a actor. But he is good in it. Surprisingly spry for a 90-year-old.
I hate to be the sour voice here, but I really didn't like this movie. And I don't want to parse IMDb ratings, but people voted gave it a negative score or a low star rating. I see where they're coming from. There are all sorts of things that get me about this movie. I mean, number one is the script. I just think it's a lousy script. I think the relationships are poorly defined. I think the Dwight Yoakam character is one that's never actually makes any sense. I do think Eastwood is too old for this role, even though, he's a 90-year-old who looks like he's 82 and a guy who's famously into healthy living his entire life. So he's very robust for his age. But I never buy this. I never buy that Dwight Yoakam is sending this man, even if it's only his third choice, but sending this man to Mexico to essentially kidnap his son. I think there are problems with the acting. And the whole women continually throwing themselves at Eastwood, which has been constant in movies throughout his career. I mean, we can see it in Pale Rider and more dubiously and more uncomfortably in High Plains Drifter. It seems especially ridiculous here with the mother of the boy character.
It's the Woody Allen syndrome.
Yeah, I mean, and Scottish Adam is right. I mean, it's probably because this is Eastwood's experience in his life, and I get it. He's a handsome man, but within the context of the story, I think it doesn't work at all. I'm tempted to wonder whether finally Eastwood has lost his fastball as a director. He's been hitting this theme of aging and the difficulties of aging, for 3 decades now. Now, in the past, both counted Eastwood out, and he's come back with great movies. So I hope, the upcoming Juror number 2, that's his next movie, I hope that proves me wrong. I hope he keeps making movies for years, and they're great. But a movie like this gives me some pause.
So, Scottish Adam, since you're the one who thought that the women throwing themselves at Clint were the most realistic, what was your assessment of the film?
I definitely don't think it was realistic in the film. I think, like American Adam said, maybe that is what influences Eastwood's decision to have those kind of scenes. I didn't personally think the scene with the mum and Clint Eastwood worked well at all. But overall, I'm still more with Chris than I am with American Adam. I think 5.7 is a really harsh rating. I think it's still a decent film. I have issues with it. I mean, I think there's some parts of it that remind me of Gran Torino in a certain way, and I think the acting, there's some weak acting in the film as well. From like the kid, for example, I think there's definite flaws in the film and definite weak parts to it. But as a potential sort of final film as an actor for Eastwood, I think it works relatively well given his age, given the kind of stage of his career. I think there's redeeming factors, thing like the relationship between Eastwood and the boy, and like the kind of road movie feel to it. There's a lot of things that work. I agree with American Adam, like the boy's dad, that kind of plot. There's certain parts that are pretty flimsy. But I think it's a decent effort at his age and at the end of his career. Presumably one last effort as an actor. I don't think it's the worst way to sign out, and I think a 5.7 is very harsh. I mean, it's nowhere near one of his best films, but I don't think it's one of his worst either. I think it's more in the middle.
Better than Bronco Billy.
Yeah, that seems to be the catchphrase. I was trying to avoid saying that because I feel like I've said that about every single film so far. But yeah, give me that. We've got another host, Sol, who's actually favorited one of his favorite. I don't know how many favorites he has, but one of his favorites is Bronco Billy. So it'd have been interesting to hear his perspective. But I would take Cry Macho any day over Bronco Billy, despite the flaws.
Like I said, I think as a final film as actor, I think the movie works. But I do agree with American Adam to a large extent. I do think the writing is very dodgy in places and very hackneyed. And yeah, to everyone's point, the constant like women hitting on him is very weird. But just in terms of how Eastwood carries himself in the movie, I think in general it works. I also agree with American Adam about Dwight Yoakam character. It always saddens me to see Dwight Yoakam misused. I personally like Dwight Yoakam wrote and directed this Western, South of Heaven, West of Hell, that a lot of people hated. But I personally like it quite a bit. I think he's someone with a lot of talents that don't always get leveraged in the best way.
I just want to jump in to add that the guy who wrote this movie also wrote Gran Torino and The Mule. And, you can see a lot of similarities between all of these movies in terms of certainly women throwing themselves at Eastwood, in terms of having sort of a teenage boy who becomes something of a protege. And in my opinion, at least, I think that all three are misfires. One thing I just want to add is that, we say this is perhaps Eastwood's last movie as an actor, and, that may be warranted given his age, but he said the same thing when he did Gran Torino. When he did Gran Torino, he said that was going to be his last movie as an actor, and that obviously hasn't been the case. So, banking on his good health, which I very much hope for, something tells me he's going to keep acting.
But I have to admit one thing, which is that I do actually thoroughly agree with American Adam when he says that the writing is pretty slim. I mean, you can see a lot of the things coming a mile off, and it's familiar territory. Like, if it had been a little bit darker, like this could have been like the edges of like a B noir kind of thing. It's not really that. But I think the one thing that's really, really solid for me and that made me like it so much is not really fully the idea that this is Eastwood's last, though that gives it a little bit of extra gravitas, but just his presence in it. I think that it's like just how much more frail he looks in it. He has a certain degree of vulnerability to him that he hasn't had before. I actually really liked his dynamic with the young protege as well. I thought they came together very well, and it made it a thoroughly enjoyable movie to watch. But it's certainly nothing great. I just think it's a very nice way for him to go out, because I still think even with lesser done script, not absolutely fantastic direction, though everything hangs together. I just thought that he had very strong presence in it, and I think we all agree, if it is his final one as an actor, he went out fairly well. Oh, and just to back up your point, Adam, on this film not being negative vote bombed, yeah, it was not. So the most usually when you see a film where with a 5.7 that's generally liked, like you see that the 1 stars are huge, like that row, if you click on IMDb, is just massive, and it's like the majority of the votes, or like the second or third highest rating. Here, the 1 is one of the least voted. Most people just voted it 5 or 6, with some on 7, some on 4. So most people who saw this just thought, okay, a bit less than okay, a bit more good. I'm on the upper scale of that. I guess you, Adam, is on the lower scale of that. So I suppose, even though Scottish Adam, I think the 5.7 is a bit too harsh, maybe I suppose it is reflective.
I mean, I think it's a film, like you said, that benefits from his presence as an actor, and I think that elevates it from a 5.7 to a higher rating. I think that makes a difference too. I think him being in it and his presence in the relationship with the boy elevates it from pretty mediocre to like the decent.
And with that, we've talked through all of the 7 films we wanted to talk about today. Some misfires, at least according to most of us. If any of you want to disagree with anything we've said in this episode, if you want to criticize us for our lack of focus on Clint Eastwood as the actual director please come to the icmforum.com. It will be a thread up dedicated to this episode. Tell us about it. Tell us how much you disagree or agree. Do you think Eastwood will act again? Do you think Cry Macho is better than that 5.7 rating? And has he actually made any better films than Unforgiven? We'll find out. As I mentioned, if this is a fairly popular episode, we might come back with Clint Eastwood action, crime, thriller, biopics, maybe based on real story. We'll see if there's some potential there for us to dive further into his filmography. And if you have any preferences as well, go to icmforum.com. Let us know. Maybe your suggestion will be what we do next. But with that, thank you so much for listening, and I reckon we'll see you back soon. You have been listening to Talking Images, the official podcast of icmforum.com.